July is oftentimes the start of a really unpleasant time in the garden. Right now, as I look ahead to the forecast, we are looking at 10 plus days of over 110 degrees. But our garden is in full production right now, and so it is definitely not the time to give up. So in today's show, I want to give you some tips to have success through the hot days of July and to continue to take advantage of the long growing season ahead of us. This is the Audrey's Little Farm Show. So as I record this episode in real time, we are approaching some really hot days ahead of us. And if you're here in the Central Valley of California, I'm sure you're aware. If you're in another state or another area of California, I'm sure you're going into a heat wave as well, or maybe you're in one right now. July is just typically a really hot month, no matter where you live. But that can be a struggle when you have a garden because nobody wants to be out in the garden when it's 100 plus degrees outside. At least I don't. But I have set things up in my garden to somewhat take care of themselves so that I don't have to be out there. But there's never a such thing as a completely hands-off garden. There are things you can do to make gardening so much easier in so many ways, but there is always going to be some effort on your part. And so if we can put some systems into place and figure out some routines that help things to be a little bit easier, gardening is always going to be more enjoyable. And so I want to give you some of my best tips and practices that I've put into place so that hopefully you can take them to your garden and have a bit more of an enjoyable season this year, even if it's going to be really hot. So my first tip is to automate watering. This is by far the most beneficial thing I've ever done in my garden. I think I've mentioned it probably in every episode I've recorded because it's that important. I truly cannot imagine having to water my garden every day right now. We have a really large garden, and if I had to water everything by hand, it would probably take me 2 hours to thoroughly water my plants. And when it's this hot, they need extra water. Sometimes you might even have to water twice a day. And so I just can't imagine that in this stage of life. I have a 2-year-old son, and so I'm blessed that I get to stay home with him, but I'm working before he wakes up. I'm working during nap time. And then while he's up, we're outside playing and enjoying our day together. And then when my husband gets home from work, it's time for family dinners and things like that. And so I don't have time to spend watering my garden. And I know you might be shaking your head thinking that's just part of the garden, but imagine all the things you could do if you didn't have to spend time watering. You could spend more time preserving your harvest, or maybe even planting different types of varieties and experimenting. You could be working on saving seeds from your own garden, propagating plants. There's so many fun gardening things you can do when you can take away the chore of watering. So I definitely recommend automating the watering process if possible. I have an entire course on this. It's called Effortless Irrigation, and it walks you through all the steps of setting up irrigation in your home garden. And so if you want to check that out, I'll be sure to link to it below. But basically, it's a one-time setup that is going to save you hours and hours for every garden season to come. And then the other really important thing when it comes to watering this time of year when it's really hot is to adjust your watering schedule. So a watering schedule is going to vary throughout the entire year and sometimes even week by week. So for example, it's been in the 90s over the last couple of weeks for us. We've had a couple days in the hundreds. But pretty much I've been able to get away with watering my garden every other day or every 2 days, and I water for about 15 minutes per day. However, now that it is 100 plus degrees for such a long stretch in a row, I have changed the frequency so that I'm watering every day versus every other day or every few days. And there might even be some evenings when I'm going to water again in the evening. I'll just use the manual setting on the timer instead of having it set. I will just check on my garden at the end of the day, and if it looks like things are pretty thirsty, then I'll give an extra watering in the evenings. But if my soil still feels moist, and my plants look okay, then I'll just keep it to the once per day. So this is definitely going to vary based on your soil and your exact weather, but you're probably going to need to adjust your watering frequency and maybe even the length of time that you're watering. One thing to keep in mind, though, as you're watering is after a certain point of the water going into the soil, it's no longer watering the root system. At a certain point, the water is just going away from the plants. So if you have the hose on, say, for an hour, probably after about 15 to 20 minutes, it's really not doing much. You're just somewhat wasting water because the water is leaving the root zone of your vegetable plants. And I do recommend slower and more and longer periods of watering versus just a quick watering from the top that really only gets the first few inches of your soil moist. But the best thing you can do is actually water in intervals. So, for example, you would water for about 10 to 15 minutes slowly so that the water is really going down deep into the soil. And then, say, maybe even just an hour or 2 hours later, water again for another 5 or 10 minutes. Or it could even be that evening, as long as the soil is still moist. So when the soil is moist, it absorbs the water better. Sometimes, I'm sure you've seen it, if the water is really hard and compacted, it takes a little bit for the water to actually seep through. But then once that soil is moist, it drains really well. That's why in the beginning of the rain season, it's a lot more likely for areas to flood because the ground is just so dry, the water doesn't absorb. But as we start getting some rain, water absorbs pretty quickly. And so keep that in mind as you're watering your plants. Sometimes watering multiple times, but at spaced out intervals, is going to water your plants much more effectively than just letting the hose or the irrigation system stay on for a really long time. And then my next tip is to harvest early and often. And I recommend this, of course, throughout the entire year, but it's especially important when it gets this hot because if you wait too long to harvest, you're going to just keep putting it off. So if you can just harvest a little bit every day and stay on top of it all, you're going to really appreciate it as the days get warmer. I know the other day I had a ton of peppers to harvest, and I had waited a few days without going out to the garden. And then to actually harvest everything took me about an hour. Just clipping individually takes a while. And then there's certain crops that are really a pain to harvest, like green beans. I don't know if you're growing green beans at the moment, but harvesting bush green beans is probably one of my least favorite tasks in the garden. I appreciate how fast they grow, and they're such an easy plant to grow, but harvesting is such a pain. And so the more frequently you harvest, the better. And then my next tip is to get help. I don't know if you're anything like me, but I have a really hard time asking for help out in the garden because the garden is really my hobby. My family definitely enjoys it and they love being out there with me, but the garden itself is really my passion and my hobby. And I feel bad asking help from other people because if they don't want to be out there pulling weeds, they shouldn't have to be. So we actually live on the same property as my parents. The houses are a little ways apart, but my husband and I and my son live about 100 yards from my parents' house. So it's really great. We're all on the same property. But my husband is, works during the week. I'm home taking care of our son. And then my parents, they both still work and they enjoy the garden. So does my husband, but it's really my project. And so I don't want to I don't want to use up their time when they're on their days off to do things like pull weeds and take care of all the harvesting that needs to be done and pruning. And, there's so much that goes into growing a garden at times. But sometimes you have to ask for help. And right now we're in the summer, so there's lots of high school kids out. Maybe there might be someone that lives down the street that you could hire to help, or just ask a family member for help. I know for myself, that's a difficult thing to do, but I actually just recently hired some landscapers to come in. They cleared out all of the weeds. They chopped down old plants that were still overgrown from the winter season that I just hadn't cleared out yet, and just did a ton of work. Now everything is back to par. Everything looks great. And now it's really easy to keep up with everything. Now, as I walk through the garden, there's just a few weeds here and there. And so it was definitely worth hiring that out. So just to be, caught back up. It would have taken me weeks and weeks, and I would have had to hire babysitters if I was actually going to do it myself. And then it takes away time from doing everything else. So definitely don't be afraid of getting help if you can. And it might even be something that someone enjoys doing. Maybe you have some kids in your local neighborhood that just want to spend their time outdoors during the summer months. And it might not even be that you have to pay them. Maybe they just want to lend a hand. And then replant. There's still so much that you can grow in July, even though, it kind of feels like we're reaching the end of the season because now it's so hot and we don't want to be out in the garden. There's still such a long, warm season ahead of us. And you can pretty much plant any warm season crop right now that you want. So you can replant your cucumbers, squashes, okra, beans. You can replant your tomatoes, your peppers. I would suggest with your tomatoes, if you have tomatoes growing right now, is to take a clipping off of your plants. If you clip off a sucker and put it in some potting soil, it will grow roots, and then you can transplant that tomato out in the garden. So instead of starting seeds or going to your local nursery to buy some transplants, you can just start your own right off the plants you already have. And in fact, I have a video about this. I have a different YouTube channel that is just Audrey's Little Farm. And I have all kinds of tutorial videos and how-to videos there. Whereas this Audrey's Little Farm YouTube channel is just for the podcast. So if you want to check out that video, I'll link to it in the description, but I have the step-by-step process showing you how to root your own tomato plants. It's super simple and such a great way to get some more use out of your current tomato plants, but then extend your harvest later into the season. You can even do this at the end of the season and then put some of those tomatoes in the greenhouse and overwinter them so you could get fresh tomatoes all throughout the winter too. And so just don't forget that you can replant right now. I like to plant all throughout the season so that I have spaced out harvests. I have younger and older crops so that as the older crops start getting less productive, I have younger crops ready to pick from. And so it's just a really great way to space out harvests and make sure you always have healthy younger plants growing. And if you want help, all of that information is in my Zone 9 Garden Club. I do monthly garden tours and teachings. I give you monthly planting calendars. And so I would love for you to join. You could get a 14-day free trial if you check out the link in the description. But basically, you'll never have to figure out any of your planting dates on your own or what you should be planting during that month. I give all of that information to you. Plus, I give you the video tour walking you through the garden and showing you how to do it. So check that out in the description if you'd like. Or, if the Zone 9 Garden Club isn't appealing to you at this point in time, I also have a free planting schedule for you. And that'll just give you all of your first and last planting dates, and then you can just figure out everything in between. But basically, it will give you a range of when you can first plant in the beginning of the season, and then it will give you a range of dates that are your last planting dates, and you can plant all the way from your first up until that last planting date. So that will be really helpful for you as well. And so that the link for that free planting schedule will be in the description also. But basically, the way that you'll figure out your last planting date for your warm season crops will be to count backwards from your first expected frost. So for example, if you have your first expected frost on December 1st, if that's your average, then and something took 60 days to reach maturity, you would count backwards 60 days from December 1st, and then give yourself a few extra weeks just in case. And as long as you plant by that date, that crop should be mature and ready to pick before December 1st. So that's how you figure out those last planting dates for your warm season crops. And then another thing to do right now throughout these hot months is to start planning for your fall garden. I know it kind of seems a little bit crazy because it's hot right now and we're not thinking about planting cool season crops. But right now, as we're spending more time indoors, think about all the things you want to plant in your fall garden, and then, possibly order seeds if you need to order some seeds, or just make a plan of what you want to grow. Or if there's something you need to work on in the garden before fall planting, for example, putting together some raised beds, clearing out an in-ground area, and maybe amending the soil, whatever it is that needs to be done before the fall season so that you can get everything in the ground on time. And now, before getting to our last tip, I want to give a quick shout out to one of our listeners. JW Wade says in a review, "I am thankful that I found this podcast. I am looking for advice and insight on Zone 9 gardening, and she has been most helpful in just a couple of episodes I've listened to so far. Very encouraging and simple to understand advice." So thank you so much for leaving that review. If you have not left a review yet, I would truly appreciate it. You can leave a review on Apple. You can rate the podcast on Spotify, leave a comment, or subscribe on YouTube. There's so many different ways you could reach out, but I read every review and comment, and so I just wanted to read that because it was very encouraging for me to read. I love just reading that and knowing that the podcast is reaching the ears and eyes of the viewers. So thank you very much for that. And if you leave a review, there's a good chance that I'll be reading it in a future episode. And so now for our last tip, which is to check for pests. So this is something you should do throughout the entire gardening season, but just know that as the weather gets warmer and plants are more stressed, it is more likely for pest problems to come up. And I actually just got a book. It's pretty much a complete guide to identifying problem pests and beneficial insects, and it gives natural solutions for all of the various, pest problems, and then just how to naturally treat that solution, which is usually by not doing anything except for just attracting in more beneficial insects. But it's a really, really good book. It's really helpful at identifying the bugs, because sometimes you may think that something is harmful when it's actually beneficial, or vice versa. And so I just got this book for myself, and I will be sure to link to it in the description, but it's a book that I recommend for every gardener. But basically, when plants get more stressed, more problems will arise. So just be extra diligent about checking your plants for pests during the hot months or the hot weeks, and hopefully not months to come, but hopefully just a few days or a few weeks of, this real hot weather. But make sure you check the undersides of all of the leaves. That's usually where pests will lay their eggs. And then if you can just hand pick off the bugs, that's a good quick solution. You can spray off the plants with the water hose, but just try your best not to spray. The more you spray, that means you're killing all of the beneficials, and they really help keep the problem bugs in check. This is my third, possibly fourth summer without spraying anything in my garden, and this is by far the most pest-free garden I've ever had. I have ladybugs everywhere. I have lots of other beneficial insects I've seen flying around, and very few problem bugs. I had a few squash bugs early on in the season on a few plants. They've totally cleared up from one area. I've noticed them out on a different squash plant more recently, but I just continue to pick them off by hand as I notice them, and then I check for eggs and I squash those eggs as I spot them, and the problem is just getting more and more under control as the season goes on. And then as far as other problems, I had some aphid issues early on, but I just sprayed the plants off twice with a water hose, and that's all it took. And before I knew it, the plants were covered in ladybugs. But I did do quite a few things earlier on in the season, like planting beneficial herbs and flowers all throughout my garden area to attract in all of those beneficials. And I have an entire podcast about that. It's actually episode number 1, and it's all about how to treat pests naturally and basically just bring in beneficial insects and detour bad bugs. And so just make sure to check out episode number 1 if you're interested in learning more about that. But, dealing with pests and weeds is never a fun part in the garden, but it's something, that is going to come with every garden. And so if you can just stay on top of it and learn some best practices to make it more manageable, that will make your garden more enjoyable every season to come. So I just want to thank you again for listening to another episode of the Audrey's Little Farm Show. All of the links and resources mentioned in today's show will be in the description below. If you'd like to join the Zone 9 Garden Club, I would love for you to check it out. You can start a 14-day free trial. I also have a free planting schedule for you, so be sure to head to the description, check out all of those links, and I will see you in the next episode.